Although we saw the peak of his rampage during Avengers Infinity War, Marvel fans know that the Mad Titan Thanos has been kicking ass and taking names around the galaxy for ages. But now, things are definitely coming to a head as we get ready for Endgame, and Thanos has a huge target on his back. Maybe it wasn't the best idea for him to take off his armor and use it as a scarecrow. Although many fans believe Thanos will end up dying at the hands of our heroes during Endgame, we're gonna debunk this theory and let you know how we think things may plan out for the Mad Titan. Getting rid of half of all life in the universe in one fell swoop is a career highlight if you're a supervillain, and it's something Thanos famously accomplished during Infinity War. But this wasn't the first time we took notice that the Mad Titan was skulking around the MCU just waiting for the right moment to strike. All the way back in the first Thor movie, we spotted a glimpse of an Infinity Gauntlet tucked away in Odin's vault. And of course, because we're Marvel comic fans, we couldn't help but come up with a million fan theories about what Odin was doing with an Infinity Gauntlet, and what this could mean for upcoming movies. Hey, scrutinizing every single aspect of Marvel movies is kind of our thing. Eventually, our theories were crushed when Hela revealed the gauntlet was a fake during the movie Thor Ragnarok. Man, besides crushing Mjolnir, slaughtering the citizens of Asgard, and ultimately leading to its destruction, that had to be the worst thing Hela ever did. Many other Marvel comic book fans were excited about this particular Easter egg too, so they weren't entirely surprised by the mid-credit scene of the Avengers. This was the first time we saw Thanos himself on the big screen, and it kicked off a 6-year-long build-up to Infinity War. It was revealed that Thanos was the one behind Loki getting his hands on the Tesseract, which caused a massive amount of destruction, culminating in the Battle of New York. It also made us realize that it would take an entire fleet of superheroes in order to stand a chance against Thanos.
That up there, that's the endgame.
And that's exactly what we watched develop in the following years. We saw Thanos again during Guardians of the Galaxy, and originally, the Mad Titan was supposed to have a much larger role in the movie. But Thanos is a massively imposing character, and we don't just mean that literally, although that's certainly true as well. The movie was amazing and introduced a ton of great heroes into the MCU, but overall, it didn't have any major links to the universe as a whole. Instead, Marvel Studios decided to minimize the amount of Thanos and save him for a movie where he could have a much larger role. Instead, we mostly had it told to us that Thanos is a really powerful villain.
Thanos?
Who added terrible father to his growing list of misdeeds. The post-credit scene of Avengers Age of Ultron featured both the Mad Titan and the Infinity Gauntlet, but this was another minor appearance on Thanos' part. It was so anticlimactic that some people simply referred to him as the man in the floating chair, which is something we wouldn't advise saying to his face if you ever find your way into the MCU. The point is, Thanos is far more than a throwaway villain, and we don't just mean this in terms of how powerful he is. He's someone who's been lurking in the MCU for a long time, and even in movies where he doesn't appear, his presence is still felt. During Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, Thanos didn't need to show up in order to exert his power. The animosity he fostered between Gamora and Nebula was a huge part of the movie, and the main reason Nebula isn't an official Guardian of the Galaxy. She's been so consumed with the hatred for all Thanos has put her through that vengeance is all she can think about. And when you consider that instead of giving her a participation trophy when she lost, Thanos would remove her body parts and replace them with mechanical ones, it's pretty hard to blame her. Thanos and his Black Order are exactly the kind of threats Tony Stark talked about feeling terrified of during Age of Ultron. They're massive, extraterrestrial forces wielding unimaginable power, and even the combined effort of our favorite heroes wasn't enough to stop them. In a way, Thanos perfectly represents the looming threat which has been plaguing Tony and the rest of the Avengers this whole time. Part of the reason we don't anticipate Thanos being destroyed for good during Endgame has to do with some important differences between the version of Thanos we see in the MCU and the one from the comic books. In many ways, these two characters are very similar to one another. They're both massively powerful megalomaniacs who happen to be a particularly pleasant shade of purple. But there's one aspect of comic book Thanos that might be surprising to fans who haven't read the books. Thanos has a love life. If you're done gagging, don't worry. We aren't going to talk about specifics.
If you're watching this video, your parents have elected for you not to be present in the health class for a discussion of
But let's just say that in the comic books, Thanos actually has a girlfriend. And by girlfriend, we mean he's romantically involved with a personification of death itself. But we aren't here to judge. You do you, Thanos. Love is love. Yes, Death is an actual character in Marvel Comics, and she's often depicted as a skeleton head wearing a cloak. She's a looker, isn't she? Death and Thanos have an extremely long history together. Kinda like a Ross and Rachel thing, except infinitely more horrifying. We won't go over the entire weird love story, but Thanos is really into her, and would pretty much do anything in order to gain her love and affection. Most of us have been there, but most of us haven't quite gone to the lengths Thanos has been to in order to impress somebody. The comic book version of the events of Infinity War is different, but one major alteration made for the movie version is Thanos' motivation. In the comic books, Thanos wants to collect all of the Infinity Stones and wipe out half of all life in the universe because he wants to impress Lady Death, and thinks this will make her like him. Oh, Thanos, you gotta find someone to love you for who you are. Well, we suppose that's probably easier said than done for someone like Thanos. After he collects all the Infinity Stones, Thanos wipes out half of all life in the universe in order to woo Death, and it works. Thanos gets the girl, at least for a little while. But as we all know, Lady Death doesn't exist within the confines of the MCU, and at this point, we doubt she's going to be showing up. Instead, we got an entirely different motivation for Thanos' actions during his time in the MCU. He explains that he doesn't want to wipe out half of all life in the universe for personal gain, or to get some hot skeleton makeouts. No, he's doing this for the greater good, the battle cry of people who don't see themselves as the villains they are. As much as we love the comic books, we know that not everything from the books can be included in the MCU. Not only is there simply not enough time, but comic books aren't perfect, even though we know it's sacrilegious to point that out. We try to look at the big picture, and not complain about minor differences like Drax the Destroyer being green in the comics and bluish in the MCU. But Thanos' motivation was a huge thing to change, and honestly, it was kind of disappointing at first. We aren't saying we're proud of him or that we condone his actions, but Thanos killing half of all living things to impress a woman? Yeah, that sounds about right in accordance with his character, and really highlights his selfishness and short-sightedness. Instead, in the MCU, we get this quasi-moral conundrum in which Thanos claims he knows there aren't enough resources to sustain all of the current life, and in order to prevent pain and suffering later on, it's better to just wipe out half of all life in the universe with a snap of his fingers, instead of watching life waste away. Now, here's a question for you. We've talked about Thanos' appearances in the MCU prior to Infinity War, and what his presence has meant for our heroes. During all of this time, what clues have we seen that show us that Thanos is concerned with preventing pain and suffering? If your answer is nothing, you're right. If it wasn't, you're reaching. Admit it. If Thanos was truly worried about preventing misery, he could have just as easily have wished for twice as many resources instead of half as many people. But he didn't. And according to the Russo brothers, this isn't because he couldn't have figured it out. Come on, we're accusing the guy of being a ruthless, murderous monster, not of being stupid. They claim Thanos is so full of himself that he's been seeing himself as a type of savior all this time. This makes sense and ties into the greater good nonsense Thanos talks about to try and justify his actions. Thanos throwing Gamora off a cliff on Vormir was a really important scene. Sure, your initial reaction was probably that it showed just how terrible Thanos really is, and that he'll go to great lengths to achieve his goal, but that's not really what we should be taking away from this scene. Consider Red Skull for a moment. We saw the sort of evil things he can accomplish and just how motivated he is to succeed during Captain America: The First Avenger. After committing no shortage of atrocities to get his hand on one Infinity Stone, he wound up guarding another one for decades. Why? Because, as we learned during Infinity War, you need to be able to sacrifice someone you love in order to obtain the Soul Stone. And the Red Skull didn't love anybody. When Thanos killed Gamora, it proved that he was indeed capable of love. We're not trying to romanticize it or say that it proves Thanos is actually a good or caring person deep down. It doesn't. Thanos is a selfish and terrible person, and loving someone doesn't mitigate this in any way. The weight of this decision was reaffirmed at the end of the movie, when Thanos was confronted by an adorable little aspect of Gamora inside the Soul Stone, and he looked rather choked up about the whole thing. Marvel Studios really drove it home that Thanos doesn't see himself as the evil brute the rest of us do, and that he's capable of love in some forms. They've spent years building him up as a powerful character, and in between all of the fighting and carnage, made a genuine effort to show that he's capable of emotions and thoughts beyond just wanting to destroy things and thinking about the best and most painful painful ways to destroy them. Whether you like the comic book or the movie version of Thanos better is entirely up to you. We just wanted to point out that Marvel Studios clearly tried to convey that there's some depth to Thanos, a character they spent years teasing us with before finally introducing us to him. And this is a huge reason why we believe Endgame isn't really going to be the end of Thanos. There are many moments involving Thanos which stand out from the rest of his comic book appearances. There's the time Lady Death chose being with him over locking lips with Deadpool, the time Thanos flew around in the Thanos copter, and of course, the time when he retired to a quiet life as a farmer. In the MCU, Thanos doesn't have Lady Death in his life, so it's probably only a matter of time before he ends up on farmersonly.com when he gets lonely. Many of us comic book fans were wondering if Farmer Thanos could show up in the MCU, and based on the trailer for Endgame, it appears he does. By now, even non-comic book fans have undoubtedly heard the legend of old Farmer Thanos. It's the classic story of a mad titan achieving all of his dreams, realizing something is missing and deciding to live a life of quiet solitude and farming crops. He even hangs up his armor quite literally in order to both scare away crows and symbolize that he's done with fighting. We love items that do double duty just like that. This was the Thanos we saw during the Endgame trailer, but there's another big difference between comic book Thanos and MCU Thanos here. In the movies, it appears Thanos went straight from the decimation to playing some real-life Stardew Valley, but that's not how it happened in the comic books. The events Infinity War is based on occur during a 6-part miniseries called Infinity Gauntlet. There are many differences between Infinity Gauntlet and Infinity War. In the comic books, Thanos also uses an Infinity Gauntlet in order to wipe out half of all life in the universe, but he doesn't go right from being on top of the world to setting down on a farm. Killing all of those people was only the beginning of Thanos' evil deeds in the comic books. He traps Nebula in a living hell in which she can neither die nor escape. He creates a shrine to worship death, and he sets about tormenting various heroes. Really terrible, no-holds-barred kind of stuff that makes what he did to Vision in Infinity War look like child's play. He suffocates Cyclops, sends Drax the Destroyer back in time, and turns Thor into glass before shattering him in a million pieces. He's basically the biggest overpowered jerk imaginable for a while, and as you've probably guessed, this immediately goes to his head. In fact, Thanos is so full of himself, he actually transcends his physical body. We're pretty sure this is the highest level of smugness, which us mere mortals could never hope to achieve. But turning into an astral entity has some serious drawbacks, such as not being able to effectively guard your Infinity Gauntlet. This gives Nebula the opportunity to nab it and undo all of the evil Thanos has done. But this isn't the end of the story, because Nebula's motivations are kind of suspect too. Even in the MCU, Nebula isn't really a superhero. She's not someone who fights for what they believe is right, like, say, Captain America. The only thing she seems to care about is tearing down Thanos, and once that's accomplished, what's her next move? Would she use her newfound powers for good or for evil? Unlike most of the other characters in the MCU, it's kinda hard to predict what Nebula would do with an Infinity Gauntlet, because up until now, her only real motivation has been revenge. Even in the comic books, Nebula doesn't really use the gauntlet to restore life because it's the right thing to do. She does it to make Thanos angry. Most people don't have to work so hard to disappoint their parents, but Nebula isn't most people, or even mostly people at this point, considering all those robotic parts. Anyway, in the comics, the good guys eventually get the Infinity Gauntlet away from the unpredictable Nebula, and even Thanos helps out. You see, a quick peek at his soul via the Soul Gem reveals that deep down, he knew he was unworthy of wielding the gauntlet. Sure, she does it out of her own anger, but Thanos knowingly helped out in his own way. After order is relatively restored, that's when Thanos decides to retire to farming. Right now in the MCU, we haven't gotten to this point yet. Thanos hasn't admitted to any weaknesses. He hasn't done anything to redeem himself, and quite frankly, it doesn't seem like the MCU is done with him by a long shot.
Oh yeah. You're much more of a Thanos.
We've talked a lot about Thanos specifically, but let's now change gears for a moment and talk about what makes a good villain. We love Marvel movies, and they've really mastered portraying compelling heroes that we can't get enough of. But it seems like they've struggled to make us feel the same way about their villains for the most part.
This is the Mandarin?
I know, it's embarrassing.
We're leaving out Loki for now, but don't worry, we'll get to him later. The first major villains we saw in the MCU were Obadiah Stane from Iron Man, the Abomination from the Incredible Hulk, and Red Skull from Captain America: The First Avenger. Now, we aren't saying these villains are terrible, but they pretty much exist to be the polar opposites of the superheroes they're fighting against. It was like they only existed in order to establish the powers and personalities of Iron Man, Hulk, and Captain America, instead of being interesting and compelling characters in their own right. Even as Marvel Studios developed their superheroes, many of their villains remained stunted. Yes, they either want profit, revenge, or power, but many of them end up being pretty two-dimensional. At the end of the day, they just want whatever the hero of the movie doesn't want, and that's not very compelling in the grand scheme of things, especially when you're creating a universe instead of creating a standalone movie. Peyton Reed directed the movie Ant-Man, and even he admits Yellow Jacket felt like most other MCU villains, and he failed to stand out on his own. He was just a caricature of an evil businessman who cared more about making profits than protecting human life. And we know he was evil because he wanted to use Hank Pym's technology in a different way than Hank did. This is a trap so many villains fall into, and we think it's something Marvel has finally recognized. Now let's look at some compelling villains, which is exactly what we saved talking about Loki for. Is Loki really an evil person? He's done bad things, but we've also watched him struggle against a father that, quite frankly, treats him like garbage, as well as living in the shadow of a brother who even admits he was a jerk and not at all ready to be a ruler. Then, when we see Loki finally ruling Asgard during Ragnarok, he's pretty much been maintaining the status quo. It's a pretty stark contrast when compared to how an actually evil but uncompelling villain like Hela would rule. Another great villain is Eric Killmonger from Black Panther. At the end of the movie, T'Challa ended up taking Wakanda public and helping out their people, which is something Killmonger was advocating for during the movie. T'Challa and Killmonger agreed on many things, but they employed very different methods when it came to achieving their goals. It's clear that Marvel Studios tried to make Thanos a step above your average cookie-cutter villain. They replaced his romantic motivation with one designed to give him more depth and make him more morally ambiguous. Whether or not they succeeded in doing so is another issue for another YouTube video, but let's acknowledge the intent here. They've given us a character who's capable of love, trying to do the right thing despite his own personal flaws and failings, and has all the makings of an interesting villain. And let's not forget just how physically powerful Thanos is. Even without the Infinity Gauntlet, defeating him in battle seems unlikely enough, let alone decimating him to the point where he can never make a comeback. Some people wonder if Thanos is going to end up being one of the good guys in Avengers Endgame. After all, in the comic books, he does fight alongside some of our heroes in order to help them accomplish their goals, and it seems as though we're meant to feel some sympathy for him at the end of Infinity War, when we learn his mission has cost him everything he held dear. But as we just discussed, good characters, whether in movies, books, or any other form of media, are complicated. Many of them don't fit neatly into the hero or villain box, and that's what makes them interesting. Most people would readily agree that both Iron Man and Captain America are heroes. Yet in the movie Captain America Civil War, they were exchanging blows with one another. These two heroes were on opposite sides of a serious issue, yet we refer to them both as heroes instead of one of them becoming a villain. Just as one civil war doesn't turn a hero into a villain, one good deed doesn't turn a villain into a hero.
I never thought people had been hurt, lied to me.
We don't think Thanos is ever going to turn into a good guy who is heartily welcomed into the Avengers, but we do think there's a great chance that Marvel Studios will decide to keep him in the ambiguously evil zone, where Loki has spent pretty much his entire MCU existence. The fact that Thanos doesn't hail from Earth makes keeping him alive all the more likely. There's no shortage of places he could hide out until he's needed again to present a threat, help out, or simply complicate matters. The threat of Thanos and the danger he presents has long loomed over the MCU, and we just don't see that being completely done away with during Endgame. Although the movies and comics differ in many ways, we don't anticipate Thanos being any easier to defeat for good in the MCU than he is in the comic books. In the comic books, a character who has a lot to do with the Infinity Stones is Adam Warlock, who is revealed at the end of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Although the third movie in that franchise has been delayed, it's still thought that he'll be a major player in the MCU at some point in time. This could be yet another reason why it'd make sense to keep Thanos around, since he and Adam Warlock have an interesting and adversarial relationship in the comic books. We've talked a lot about what's going to happen to Thanos during Endgame and beyond. But what about the Infinity Stones themselves? They're immensely powerful objects which can be used for either great good or terrible evil. Would Doctor Strange have been able to defeat Dormammu if he didn't have the power of the Time Stone at his disposal? And the Mind Stone is responsible for Vision being able to exist at all. These stones are capable of great things, but in the wrong hands, they can clearly mean disaster. In the comic books, the Infinity Stones are responsible in no small part for shaping the evolution of Adam Warlock. Although he uses them to obtain great power and has good intentions, dimensions, ultimately they're deemed too strong for any one person to wield. Instead, they're divided up amongst various heroes, with Adam Warlock maintaining possession of the Soul Stone. With the firing of Guardians of the Galaxy director James Gunn and the delay of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, Adam Warlock's future in the MCU is uncertain. But since he was introduced at the end of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, we're guessing he's going to show up at some point, and it would be truly difficult to create a version of Adam Warlock that never encounters the Infinity Stones or Thanos. So, if we're waiting on Adam Warlock to get his highly anticipated movie, then it stands to reason the Infinity Stones and Thanos are probably going to be sticking around. The Infinity Stones may be deemed too important and useful to destroy, and Thanos may be too powerful and too good of a character to get rid of. It's hard to say what's coming in the future of the MCU, since the studio tends to be quiet about this sort of thing. But if they even attempt to stay true to the comic books, we think that Thanos is going to make it past Endgame and to whatever comes afterwards. Now that you've learned more about the comic book version of the Mad Titan, what do you think this means for Avengers Endgame? Will Thanos actually meet his end, or will he continue to live on in the MCU? Let us know in the comments section below, and don't forget to subscribe to CBR for more debunked videos. Thanks for watching.